In Matthew chapter 8, we learned that Jesus has authority over disease, over demons, over nature, and over issues of purity and impurity. But today, in Matthew chapter 9, we see that Jesus has a completely different kind of authority. Authority over sin and death. Now, in order to understand why this is so important, let's talk about these twin problems of sin and death. And, most of us are experienced followers of Jesus, so this is not unfamiliar ground for us. Nevertheless, it's ground that we want to cover every now and then so as to remind us of all that we have been given. We understand what sin is, right? Sin is disobedience of God. Now, we tend to think of that sin in sort of legal terms, but you've probably heard all your life that sin separates us from God. Now, we need to kind of nuance that at some point, talk about what that really means, but it does remind us that there is a relational fracture that takes place when sin occurs. That's going to be important here in just a moment. Part of the problem of sin, though, is its ubiquity. It's something that Paul reminds us of in Romans 1:18 through 3:20. Paul goes to great lengths to show us that every kind of person, not just every person individually, but every kind of person has to come to terms with the reality of sin in his or her own life. It doesn't matter whether you're a pastor or a prostitute. It doesn't matter whether you are president or a pauper. Sin affects us all. And the problem is that in spite of our best efforts, there's really no good and effective and sufficient way for humans to atone for their sin. Hebrews chapter 9 makes that point, but let's take a step backwards and really make sure that we understand what we're saying. Now, what is atonement? Well, atonement is making good for something that we've done wrong. So we'll use an old example. If I run over one of Bobby's cows with my car, then I can atone for that by giving him another cow. And especially if I give him a better cow than the one that I took out with my car. Okay? That's atonement. I'm making right what I did wrong. And if I tear down fence in the process, I go and I repair the fence. Right? That's, in a very real sense, that's atonement. But the problem is that there are some crimes that we commit against one another that resist atonement, right? So when I was in college, one of my majors was business, and for a business major, you have to take economics. And we were talking one day about the value of an individual person. And back in 1995, when I took that course. Economists estimated that each individual person was worth $10 million to the economy. But if you kill somebody and you offer their family $10 million, or even the equivalent in today's money, what, $17, $18 million or something like that, maybe even more, will that atone for their loss? Will that make them whole? No, it won't. It might help if the killing was unintentional, if it was due to negligence. But the truth is, nothing can atone for that death except having the person back again, right? Now, in Rwanda, there's a Roman Catholic priest who has really worked hard to try to build bridges between Hutus and Tutsis by getting people who have killed others to serve as surrogate family for the people that they killed. That's a good Christian way to approach that problem, and it builds the groundwork for forgiveness, but it's still not the same. How much more can we as humans not atone for our sin? Remembering that from a theological perspective, sin is a transgression against God. Now, it may also involve transgressions against other people, but sin is a transgression against God. Now, of course, there were atonement rituals laid out in the law. They ritualized this notion of making things right between you and God by giving up something that belonged to you. Or, for the whole people, by giving up something that belonged to the nation, right? A sheep or a goat. But there are really two problems with that. First of all, God doesn't need anything that we have. It's a point that God points out to the people through the prophets. But the other problem is the one that the writer of Hebrews points out. Those atonement rituals don't do anything to change our conscience. We still remember our sin, and we still feel guilt and shame for it. And we're still apt to do it again. Now, I want you to notice something. The paralyzed man that is described to us in chapter 9, verses 1 through 8, I'm sure that his friends brought him to Jesus hoping that Jesus would do something about his paralyzed state. And there's nothing that the man could do about his paralysis. That's why they bring him to Jesus. But what Jesus understands is that even though this man is paralyzed, he still has a sin problem that has to be dealt with. You see, that's the problem with a lot of the social theories that dominate American academia right now. Whether you describe them as social Marxism or whether you describe them, like Jonathan Haidt does, as identitarianism, whatever it is, these theories construct human life as a series of conflicts between groups. Conflicts between men and women, conflicts between ethnic groups, conflicts between heterosexuals and homosexuals. And every conflict is about one's group identity. But see, the problem is you can't divide people so neatly into oppressed and oppressor, good and bad. It doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. Yes, there are some people who have more than their fair share of victimization in their life. And we should never ignore that. And we should never use a person's sin as a reason to not deal with the hard things that they've gone through. But as Bishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa pointed out, the oppressed can often, the very next day, become the oppressor. Just because this man is lying paralyzed doesn't mean he doesn't have a sin issue that needs to be dealt with. That's true for all of us. The other problem is the problem of death. And again, part of death's problem is its ubiquity. As the writer of Hebrews points out, everybody dies. But we don't need Hebrews to tell us that. We all know it. And everybody in that crowd knew it. Sometimes we in the modern world can hide from death because we have relatively long life expectancies, our infant mortality rates are low, our maternal mortality rates are low. That's not the world in which this crowd lived. They could not hide from death. New Testament scholar Craig Keener reports that child mortality rates for those who lived in Egypt in the first century, where we have better records than we have in most places, are estimated to be about 50%. About 50% of children died before they reached adulthood. Now, the rates were probably not quite as high in Palestine, but they were still really high. Maternal mortality rates were so high that female life expectancy, we think, was actually lower than male life expectancy. That's one of the ways that you know a culture doesn't have good health care, is when female life expectancy is less than male. So there were a number of men running around Palestine who had already lost one wife, or maybe even two, in childbirth or to some other disease. And everybody in the crowds that Jesus spoke to knew somebody who had lost a child. Death was ever present for them. And for most people in the ancient world, their death was excruciatingly final. We have a lot of funerary inscriptions from the Roman world. And there is a palpable hopelessness in many of these inscriptions. The pain almost just leaps off the stone. Now, for Jews, they believed in a resurrection from the dead. At least many of them did, not all. They believed in a resurrection from the dead, but here's the thing. They didn't know when that was going to take place. They had really no clue how it was going to take place. And whenever you kind of have such an amorphous hope, it can become less and less real to you. It can become less and less a real part of your psychology. And here's the thing about death. Death is some people will tell you, look, if I lived a full life, I've had a good life, death's going to be okay, right? You actually don't hear that very often, but some people will actually say that. But what they are telling you by accident is that death makes our suffering all the more meaningless. You see, I think Paul would make the opposite argument. He would say, death's not, kind of like, well, okay, great. Yay, I get to get out of this life and I've lived a good life. I've done a lot. Okay, good, great. Things are okay. No, for Paul, death brings out all that suffering that we've experienced and makes it sort of, meaningless. By contrast, for Paul, and this is how you really see Paul's view of death without hope, for Paul, the Christian hope makes our suffering meaningful, right? But without this kind of hope, the finality of death really does make that old saying, well, we might as well eat and drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die, understandable. Why not just indulge ourselves and have fun if death is the only reality that we can count on? And remember, in Christian thought, death and sin are intertwined. These two intractable problems cannot be separated from each other. It's not because, you're dying because of your sin. Because, you have X disease because you did this sin. Now, sometimes that, we can draw those lines. But a lot of times we can't. But the big S, sin, and the big D, death, are inextricably linked. Sin produces death. And I don't think Paul would mind us saying death also produces sin. Because remember what we just said. If death is as final as people in the ancient world thought it was, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. We might as well have fun. So these are the problems that Jesus is facing as he confronts these two supplicants, these two people who are coming to him for help. And in our first story, Jesus exercises the authority to forgive sins. Notice, there's no atonement here. It is forgiveness. Now, you notice here that I'm contrasting this passage with Hebrews chapter 9. Now, in Hebrews 9, the writer there argues that Jesus has the authority to forgive sins because he paid the price for those sins, because he atoned for our sin through his death on the cross. That is certainly true. But I want to submit to you that Matthew is making an even more profound point. That Jesus has the authority to forgive sins precisely because of who he is. That is, because he is the Son of God. Notice that when this story takes place, there's been no atonement. Jesus is simply pronouncing forgiveness. Much in the same way that Isaiah is, now the language is atoned for. His sin is atoned for in Isaiah chapter 6. But it's not through a blood sacrifice. It's through the coal on the lips. It's just a symbolic act to show that his sin is taken away. Now, there's a lot of stuff we could dig into there in terms of the language, but I don't want to get us bogged down in that this morning. I want us just to notice this authority that Jesus has. It's not unprecedented, but remember, when Isaiah is atoned for, or forgiven, if you will, in that context, he's in the very throne room of God. You see the connection here? Jesus is Son of God. And so, yes, he has the authority to forgive sins. That's why the theologians that are sitting in the crowd are kind of going, wait. This is blasphemy. Now, blasphemy was a specific charge, though the charge did not always have a terribly specific definition in the ancient world. It's a very specific charge, and it is a charge that is a capital offense. You can't claim to do something that only God can do. Unless, of course, that's right. Unless, of course, you happen to be God. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Of course, he proves that he has this authority by causing the man to get up. He's no longer paralyzed. He is healed. So he's using his power over disease to demonstrate that he also has the authority to forgive. But he doesn't stop there. Do you notice there in verses 18 through 26 that Matthew's version of this story is much shorter, much less detailed than Mark's? Mark really wants to draw us into the story. He wants you to feel the angst of the woman who has this hemorrhagic disease. He wants you to feel the sadness of this synagogue leader who's coming to Jesus for help. Matthew doesn't do that as much. He shortens the story quite a bit because he wants to get to this major point. Jesus has the authority to revoke death. In Matthew's version of the story, the synagogue leader just tells Jesus, she's already dead. But if you'll come and put your hand on her, she'll live. And Jesus comes. And he does exactly as the synagogue leader suggests. He takes the girl by the hand. Now, I want you to think about this in contrast with similar miracles performed in the Old Testament. There's only one or two. Elijah, Elisha. And clearly Matthew wants to echo those stories, but at the same time, Elijah, Elisha, they have to really, really pray and plead with God to do these things. Jesus just walks in, takes the girl by the hand, and raises her up. Jesus has the authority to revoke death. Now, let's be honest. The girl will die again someday. This is a resuscitation, not a resurrection. That's the difference. Resurrection is permanent. But it is anticipatory. It points to the reality of the resurrection that is coming in Christ. And Jesus is exercising this authority to say to death, You may have her one day, but that day is not today. It is a magnificent authority. Now, in conclusion, what is Matthew doing here in chapter 9? Well, he is showing us what it means to be the Son of God. Now, having the Son of God, or being the Son of God, I should say, means authority. It means the most important spiritual authority, in that it means the authority to forgive sins. But it also means the most important physical authority, meaning the authority over death. What that means, of course, is that Jesus is the one and the only one who can meet our most urgent needs. And as his disciples, we understand this. In fact, we have bet our very lives on it. Jesus' authority is just part and parcel of who he is. I failed to mention this a while ago. When it comes to death, for example, we mentioned when it comes to forgiveness, but when it comes to death, again, there's a contrast with Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 2, I love how my old professor, Bruce Corley, paraphrases Hebrews chapter 2. His paraphrase is this: Jesus went into the very throat of death and choked the critter. But in Matthew, Jesus has authority over death precisely because of who he is, because he is the Son of God. That's something we can build our lives upon. That's something we can celebrate. Let's pray.